The Principles of Economics by Carl Menger. Chapter 5. The Theory of Price. Section 2. Price Formation under Monopoly. In the previous section, I directed attention to the fact that price formation and the distribution of goods conforms to definite laws by first considering the simplest possible case in which an exchange of goods takes place between two economizing individuals who are not influenced by the economic activity of other persons. This case, which could be termed isolated exchange, is the most common form of human trade in the early stages of the development of civilization. Its importance has survived to later times in sparsely populated backward regions, and it is not completely absent even under advanced economic conditions, since it can be observed in highly developed economies wherever an exchange of goods that have value only to two economizing individuals takes place, or where other special circumstances economically isolate two persons. But with the progress of civilization, instances in which the foundations for an economic exchange of goods are present merely for two economizing individuals occur less frequently. If, for example, A owns a horse that has a value to him equal to the value of 10 bushels of grain, if he were to acquire them, he would be better able to provide for the satisfaction of his needs, even if he were to exchange the animal for but 11 bushels of grain. To farmer B, on the other hand, who has a large stock of grain but lacks horses, a horse, if acquired, would be an equivalent for 20 bushels of his grain, and he would be better able to provide the satisfaction of his needs even if he were to give 19 bushels of grain for A's horse. Farmer B, too, would be prepared to give 29 bushels of grain for the horse, and farmer B3 39 bushels. In this case, according to what was said before, not only does a foundation exist for an exchange of the two goods between A and one other farmer, but A can, in an economic exchange, give his horse to any one of the grain farmers, and any one of the latter can economically acquire it in exchange. What has just been said becomes still more evident if we consider the case in which foundations for economic exchange operations with the grain farmers exist not only for A, but also for several other owners of horses, A2, A3, etc. Suppose that only 8 bushels of grain for A2, but 6 for A3, would, if acquired, have an equal value to one of their horses. There can be no doubt that in this case foundations for economic exchanges would exist between each of the animal breeders and each of the grain farmers. In both these cases we have to deal with much more complicated relationships than the one presented in the first section of this chapter. In the first case, foundations for economic exchange operations exist between monopolists, in the widest sense of the term, and each of several other economizing individuals who, in their efforts to exploit the exchange opportunities confronting them, are in competition with each other for the monopolized good. In the second case, the foundations for economic exchange operations are present simultaneously, on the one side for each of the several owners of one good, and on the other side for each of the several owners of another good. On each side, therefore, these persons are in competition with one another. I shall begin with the simpler of the two cases, in which there is competition between several economizing persons for a monopolized good, and later pass on to the more complicated case of price formation, when there is competition on both sides. Part A. Price formation and the distribution of goods when there's competition between several persons for a single indivisible monopolized good. In the description of price formation in isolated exchange, we saw that in each particular case there is a certain range of indeterminacy within which price formation can take place without the exchange of losing its economic character, and that the extent of this range depends upon the nature of the particular exchange situation. We also saw that the price that tends to be formed is one that divides the economic gains that can be obtained from exploitation of the relationship confronting two bargainers between them equally, and that there is thus in each given case a certain average toward which the price tends to move. But in this connection I pointed out that economic influences do not in any way, within this range of freedom, fix the point at which price formation must of necessity take place. If, for example, an economizing individual A has a horse that has a value to him no higher than 10 bushels of grain if he were to acquire them, while B, who has had a rich harvest of grain, 80 bushels, have a value equal to a horse if he were to acquire one, it is clear that the foundations for an economic exchange of A's horses for B's grain are present, provided that A and B both recognize this relationship and have the power actually to perform the exchange of these goods. But it is equally certain that the price of the horse can be formed between the wide limits of 10 and 80 bushels of grain, and can approach either of the two extremes without causing the economic character of the exchange to disappear. It is, of course, extremely improbable that the price of the horse will settle at 11 or 12 bushels, or at 78 or 79 bushels of grain. But it is certain that no economic causes whatsoever are present that exclude completely the possibility of the formation of even these prices. At the same time, it is also clear that the transaction can take place naturally only between A and B, only as long as B finds no competitor in his endeavor to acquire A's horse by trade. But suppose that B1 does have a competitor, B2, who either does not have as great an abundance of grain as B1, or requires a horse less urgently. Still B2 values a horse as highly as 30 bushels of grain, and could thus provide better for the satisfaction of his needs if he were to give 29 bushels of grain for A's horse. It is clear that the foundations for an economic exchange of a horse for some quantity of grain exist between B2 and A, as well as B1 and A. But since only one of the two competitors for A's horse can actually acquire it, two questions arise. A. With which of the two competitors will the monopolist, A, conclude the exchange transaction? And B. What will be the limits within which the price formation will take place? The answer to the first question arises from the following considerations. The value of A's horse to B2 is equal to 30 bushels of grain. He would thus provide better for the satisfaction of his needs if he were to give as much as 29 bushels of his grain to A for his horse. This is not by any means to say that B2 will immediately offer at 29 bushels for the horse, but it is certain that he will decide to make even this offer to meet the competition of B1 as far as possible, since he would be acting very uneconomically if, as a last resort, he would not be satisfied with even as small a gain from a trade as he could derive from an exchange of 29 bushels of grain for A's horse. On the other hand, B1 would obviously be acting uneconomically if, in the competition for A's horse, he were to permit B2 to acquire it for the price of 29 bushels of grain, since the economic gain of B1 would still be considerable if he were to give 30 bushels of grain or more for the horse and thereby economically exclude B2 from the exchange transaction. Thus the fact that there is a price range within which an exchange transaction would have become uneconomic for B2 but still be economic for B1 places B1 in a position to obtain for himself the gains resulting from the exchange by making the transaction economically impossible for his competitor, since A would certainly be acting uneconomically if he did not transfer his monopolized good to the competitor who is in a position to offer him the highest price for it. Nothing is more certain than that the exchange transaction will, in this particular economic situation, take place between A and B1. As concerns the second question, the limits within the price formation will take place. It is certain that the price that B1 will give A cannot reach 80 bushels of grain, since at this price the transaction would lose its economic character for B1. Nor can the price fall below 30 bushels of grain, for price information would then fall within the limits where the exchange transaction would still be advantageous for B2, who would therefore have an economic interest in competing until the price should again reach the limit of 30 bushels. In our case, therefore, the price must, of necessity, be formed between the limits of 30 and 80 bushels of grain. Thus the effect of the competition of B2 is the price formation in the exchange of goods between A and B1 will no longer take place between the wide limits of 10 and 80 bushels of grain, as would otherwise have been the case, but between the narrower limits of 30 and 80 bushels of grain. for only if the price is fixed between these limits does an economic gain from the transaction accrue to A and B1 simultaneously, with an economic exclusion of the competition of B2. The simple relationship of the isolated exchange thus reappears, the only difference being that the limits between which price formation takes place have become narrower. Aside from this difference, the principles already explained for the case of isolated exchange become fully applicable here. Suppose now that the two previous competitors for A's horse, B1 and B2, are joined by a third competitor, B3. If the value of the horse to this third individual would be equal to 50 bushels of grain, it is clear from what has just been said that the transaction again will take place between A and B1, but the price will be formed between the limits of 50 and 80 bushels. If a fourth competitor, B4, appears to whom A's horse would hate a value equal to 70 bushels of grain, the transaction will still take place between A and B1, but the price will be formed between the limits of 70 and 80 bushels. Only when a competitor, for instance, the economizing individual B5, appears on the scene, to whom the monopolized good has a value as much as 90 bushels of grain, the transaction will take place between A and this last competitor, and the price of the horse will be fixed between 80 and 90 bushels of grain. It is clear that the new competitor will exploit the exchange opportunity confronting him to his economic advantage, and that he will be in a position economically to exclude all other competitors, including B1, from the exchange. Price formation will take place between 80 and 90 bushels of grain, because, on the one hand, the competitor B1 can only be economically excluded from the transaction by a price of at least 80 bushels of grain, which prevents the price from falling below this level. And because, on the other hand, the price cannot exceed or even reach 90 bushels of grain, since the transaction would then lose its economic character for B5. What has been said is valid for every other case in which the foundations for exchange operations exist between a monopolist exchanging an indivisible good for some other good offered by several other economizing individuals. Summarizing, we obtain the following principles. 1. When several economizing individuals, for each of whom the foundations for an economic exchange are present, compete for a single indivisible monopolized good, the competitor who will obtain the good will be the one for whom it is equivalent of the largest quantity of the good offered for it in exchange. And 2. Price formation takes place between limits that are set by the equivalence of the monopolized good in question for the two competitors who are most eager, or who are in the strongest competitive position, to perform the exchange. And 3. Within these limits, the price is fixed according to the principle of price formation already demonstrated for the isolated exchange. Part B. Price formation and the distribution of goods when there is competition for several units of a monopolized good. In the preceding section, we selected as the subject our investigation the simplest case of monopoly, in which a monopolist brings a single indivisible good to market, and in which the process of price formation takes place under the influence of the competition of several economizing individuals for the good. The more complex case that I wish to discuss now is one in which the foundations for economic exchange operations exist simultaneously between a monopolist who has command of a quantity of a monopolized good on the one hand, and several economizing individuals on the other hand who have quantities of some other good at their disposal. Suppose that a newly acquired horse would have a value to farmer B1, who has a large quantity of grain but no horses, equal to 80 bushels of his grain. To farmer B2, a newly acquired horse would have a value equal to 70 bushels of grain. To B3, 60, to B4, 50, to B5, 40, to B6, 30, to B7, 20, and to B8, only 10 bushels of grain. A second horse would have a value to each of these farmers of 10 bushels less than the value of the first. A third, a value of 10 bushels less than the second, and so on. Each additional horse having a value of 10 bushels less than the preceding one, provided in each case that an additional horse is needed at all. The essential features of this economic situation can be presented in the table. If the monopolist A brings only one horse to market, it is certain, in accordance with the argument of a previous section, that B1 will acquire it at a price somewhere between 70 and 80 bushels of grain. But suppose that the monopolist brings not merely one, but 3 horses to market. Here we are concerned with the case that forms the subject of investigation in the present section. And the question is, which one or which ones of the 8 farmers will acquire the horses brought to market by the monopolist, and what price will be charged? For the answer, let us turn to our table. It appears that the first horse acquired by B1 would have a value to him equal to 80 bushels, a second a value equal to 70 bushels, and a third value equal to only 60 bushels of grain. In this situation, B1 would be acting economically if he were to acquire one horse at a price between 70 and 80 bushels, thereby economically excluding all his competitors from the exchange. But if he would act uneconomically with respect to the second horse, if he were to offer 70 bushels or more for it, since by such an exchange the satisfaction of his needs would not be better provided for than before. With the third horse, at a price that would exclude B2 from the transaction, and which must therefore be at least equal to 70 bushels of grain, the economic disadvantage to B1, and hence the non-economic character of such an exchange, would become still more obvious. The economic situation in this case is therefore such that on the one hand, B1 can exclude all his competitors from acquiring any of the 3 horses, only by concealing for each of them a price of 70 bushels of grain or more, while on the other hand he can now purchase only one horse economically at this price, and would worsen his economic position if he were to buy the other 2 at the same price. Since we are assuming that B1 is an individual behaving economically, he will not exclude his competitors from the exchange purposelessly or to his own detriment. He will exclude them from acquiring quantities of the monopolized good only if, and to the extent to which, he can thereby obtain for himself an economic advantage he would have to forego if he were to permit the other competitors to purchase quantities of the monopolized good. In our case, therefore, where an exclusion of all competitors for the monopolized good is rendered economically impossible for B1 by the economic situation, he will find himself in a position of being obliged to let B2 participate in the purchase of quantities of the monopolized good. He will eventually have a common interest with B2 in establishing the price of a unit of the monopolized good, in this case the price of a horse, at as low a level as possible under the existing circumstances. From driving the price of a horse to 70 bushels of grain or more, B1, as well as B2, will therefore have an interest in seeing that the price is fixed as much below 70 bushels of grain as is possible in the given economic situation. In these efforts, B1 and B2 will be limited by the competition of the other competitors, above all by that of B3. They will have to agree at a price at which the other competitors for the monopolized good, including B3, will be economically excluded from the transaction. Thus, in the case of 3 horses, the price will be formed between 60 and 70 bushels of grain. At a price fixed between these limits, B1 could acquire 2 horses, B2 could acquire 1, in each case economically, while other competitors would, at the same time, be excluded from acquiring quantities of the monopolized good. Price formation between these limits is the only possible result if the price were less than 60 bushels. B3 would not be excluded from the transaction and would thereby attempt to obtain for himself the gain that would result from the exploitation of the opportunity confronting him. But since B1 and B2 are economizing individuals, and since they are in a position to gain a considerable economic advantage at an even higher price, they will not allow this to happen. If the price were, on the other hand, to reach or to exceed the limit of 70 bushels of grain, B1 would be able to purchase only 1 horse, and B2 none at all, and only one of the horses offered for sale would therefore actually be sold. In the case of 3 horses, therefore, price formation outside the limits 60 and 70 bushels of grain is economically impossible. If A were to bring 6 horses to market, we could show by similar reasoning that B1 would acquire 3 horses that B2 would acquire 2 horses, that B3 would acquire 1 horse, and that the price of a horse would be formed between 50 and 60 bushels of grain. If A were to bring 10 horses to market, B1 would acquire 4 horses, B2 3 horses, B3 2 horses, and B4 1 horse, and the price would be formed between 40 and 50 bushels of grain. If the monopolist A should offer still larger quantities of the monopolized good for sale, there is no doubt on the one hand that an ever smaller number of farmers would be economically excluded from purchasing quantities of the monopolized good, and on the other hand that the price of a given quantity of the monopolized good would be pressed down to successively lower levels. By imagining the symbols B1, B2, etc. to stand, not for single individuals but for groups of the population of a country, using B1 to designate the group of economizing individuals who are most eager and in the strongest competitive positions to exchange grain for the monopolized good, B2 designate the group of economizing individuals who are next in eagerness and in competitive strength, and so on, we obtain a model of monopoly trade as it actually appears under the conditions of everyday life. We find classes of people of very different purchasing power competing for the quantities of monopolized goods reaching the market. As was demonstrated for single individuals, we find some of these classes economically exclude others from purchasing. We observe that the classes of people that must forego the consumption of a monopolized good become more numerous the smaller the quantity of the good brought to market, and vice versa, that a monopolized good penetrates the classes that are lower in purchasing power the larger the quantity marketed. With these changes, the prices of monopolized goods are seen to rise and fall. Summarizing what has been said, we obtain the following principles. 1. The quantity of monopolized good offered for sale by a monopolist is acquired by those competitors for it to whom the largest quantities of the good offered in exchange for it are the equivalents of the unit of the monopolized good. The monopolized good is distributed in such a way that the quantity of good given in exchange, that is the equivalent of 1 unit of the monopolized good, is equal for each of the purchasers of portions of the monopolized good, 50 bushels of grain equal to 1 horse, for example. 2. Price formation takes place between limits that are set by the equivalent of 1 unit of the monopolized good to the individual least eager and least able to compete, who still participates in the exchange, and the equivalent of 1 unit of the monopolized good to the individual most eager and best able to compete for the competitors who are economically excluded from the exchange. 3. The larger the quantity of the monopolized good offered for sale by the monopolist, the fewer will be the competitors for it, who will be economically excluded from acquiring portions of it, and the more completely will those economizing individuals be provided with it, who would have been in a position to acquire portions even if smaller quantities of it have been offered for sale. And 4. The larger the quantity of monopolized good offered for sale by the monopolist, the lower in terms of purchasing power and eagerness to trade will they have to descend among classes of competitors for the monopolized good in order to sell the whole quantity, and hence the lower also will be the price of 1 unit of the monopolized good. Part C. The influence of the price fixed by a monopolist on the quantity of monopolized good that can be sold and on the distribution of the good among the competitors for it. As a rule, a monopolist does not bring even quantities of a monopolized good to market with the intention of selling the whole amount under all circumstances, and of awaiting the result of competition in the determination of the price, as at an auction. His usual procedure is rather to bring a quantity of the monopolized good to market, or to keep it ready for sale, and to ask a fixed per unit price for it. The reason for this is generally to be found in practical considerations, especially in the fact that the method of selling goods described in the preceding section requires both the simultaneous congregation of the largest possible number of the competitors for the monopolized good, and the observance of numerous formalities, if the price is to be determined by the joint influence of all the effective economic factors involved. These considerations appear to make employment of this method of marketing appropriate only in particular and not too frequent cases. Whenever the monopolist can count on conquering all or at least a sufficient number of competitors, and when the necessary formalities can be observed without disproportionate economic sacrifices, as in the case of an auction of a monopolized article in a well-known auction hall announced some time in advance, he will, of course, use the method described in the previous section as the one most certain to enable him to dispose of the entire amount of the monopolized good at his command in the most economic manner. He will also choose an auction when he must sell out a substantial stock of a monopolized good completely within a limited period of time. But the ordinary procedure adopted by monopolists in marketing his commodities will, as has been said, be one in which he has the available quantities of the monopolized good ready for sale, but offers only partial quantities to the competitors for it at a price set by him. Where a monopolist sets the price of a unit of the monopolized good and lets the competing purchasers choose the quantities to meet their requirements for the good at the given price, and where the question of the price formation is therefore excluded from the immediate problem from the first, the questions we must investigate are: 1. Which competitors will be economically excluded from acquiring quantities of the monopolized good at each given level of the price of a unit of it? 2. What will be the influence of the higher or lower level at which the price is set by the monopolists on the quantities of the monopolized goods sold? And 3. In what manner will the quantity of the monopolized good actually sold be distributed among the various competitors for it? To begin with, it is evident that if the monopolist were to fix the price of a unit of the monopolized good at so high a level that a unit of it would not have value equal to the price demanded by the monopolist, even for the competitor who is most eager and best able to make the exchange, all the competitors for the monopolized good would be excluded from acquiring any portions of it, and no sales could take place at all. This would be the case in the situation described in the table above, if the monopolist A were to fix the price of a horse at 100, or even only slightly more than 80 bushels of grain, since it is clear that an economic exchange would be an impossibility at so high a price for any of the 8 competitors of the monopolized good mentioned in our example. But suppose that the monopolist fixes the price of a horse at a lower level than that which would economically exclude all the competitors for the monopolized good from acquiring quantities of it. In their endeavor to improve their economic positions, they will doubtless grasp the proffered opportunity and actually enter into exchange transactions with the monopolist within the limits explained in the previous section. But it is clear that the level of the price will be an essential determinant of the scope of these transactions. If, for example, A were to set the price of a horse at 75 bushels of grain, B1 could economically purchase 1 horse. If the price were fixed at 62 bushels of grain, B1 could purchase 2 horses and B2 1 horse. If the price were set at 54 bushels of grain, B1 would purchase 3, B2 2, and B3 1. At a price of 36 bushels of grain, B1 would buy 5, B2 4, B3 3, and B4 2, and B5 1 horse, and so on. If our example is extended as before, and we imagine the symbols B1, B2, B3, etc. to represent groups of competitors who differ in purchasing power and in their desire to trade, we see most distinctly the influence exercised on the economy by prices fixed by a monopolist at different levels. The higher the price, the more numerous will be the individuals, or classes of individuals, who are excluded completely from consuming the monopolized good. The scantier will be the provisionings of the other classes of the population who are not completely excluded, and the smaller will be the quantities of the monopolized good that the monopolist can sell. With reductions in price, on the other hand, progressively fewer economizing individuals or classes of individuals will be excluded completely from acquiring any quantities of the monopolized good. The provisioning of individuals who are already participating in the trade at higher prices will be more complete, and the sales of the monopolist will progressively increase. What has just been said can be stated more precisely in terms of the following principles. 1. When a monopolist sets the price of a unit of a monopolized good, the competitors for the monopolized good who are excluded from acquiring quantities of it are those for whom one unit of the monopolized good is the equivalent of a quantity of the good offered in exchange that is equal to or less than the price of the monopolized good. 2. Competitors for quantities of monopolized good for whom one unit of it is the equivalent of a quantity of the good offered in exchange that is larger than the price fixed by the monopolist will supply themselves with quantities of the monopolized good up to the limit at which one unit of it becomes for them the equivalent of an amount of the good offered in exchange that is equal to the monopoly price. The quantity of the monopolized good that will be acquired by each of these competitors at each price set by the monopolist is determined by the foundations for economic exchange operations existing for each individual at that price. 3. The higher a monopolist sets the price of a unit of a monopolized good, the larger will be the class of competitors for the monopolized good who are excluded from acquiring it. The less completely will the other classes of the population be provided with it, and the smaller will be the sales of the monopolist. Opposite relationships hold in the reverse case. Part D. The principles of monopoly trading. The policy of monopolist. In the two previous sections, I have explained the influence of a larger or smaller quantity of monopolized good offered for sale on the determination of its price, and the influence of a higher or lower price set by the monopolist on the quantity of a monopolized good that will be sold. In both cases, I discussed the influence of the policy adopted on the distribution of the monopolized good among the various competitors for it. Throughout the analysis, we have seen that the monopolist is not the only person determining or decisive in the course of economic events. Not only does the general principle of all economic exchanges of goods, according to which both parties must derive an economic advantage from the exchange, maintain its validity unimpaired in the case of monopoly, but within the trading range delimited by this factor. The monopolist is not completely unrestricted in influencing the course of economic events. As we have seen, if the monopolist wishes to sell at a particular quantity of the monopolized good, he cannot fix the price at will, and if he fixes the price, he cannot at the same time determine the quantity that will be sold at that price he has set. He cannot, therefore, sell large quantities of the monopolized good and at the same time cause the price to settle at as high a level as it would have reached if he had marketed smaller quantities. Nor can he set the price at a certain level and at the same time sell as large a quantity as he could sell at lower prices. But what does give him an exceptional position in economic life is the fact that he has, in any given instance, a choice between determining the quantity of the monopolized good to be traded or its price. He makes this choice by himself and without regard to other economizing individuals, considering only his economic advantage. It is thus in his power to regulate price by offering smaller or larger quantities of the monopolized good for sale, or to regulate the quantity of the monopolized good traded by raising or lowering the price, always in accordance with his economic interest. A monopolist will therefore raise his price within the limits between which exchange operations have economic character, if he anticipates a greater economic gain from selling small quantities of the monopolized good for a high price. He will lower his price if he finds it more to his advantage to market large quantities of the monopolized good at a lower price. In the beginning, he will set the price as high as possible and thus market only small quantities of the monopolized good, later lowering the price step by step to increase sales and thereby exploiting all classes of the population in succession, if he can obtain the greatest economic gain by following this procedure. But he will market large quantities of the monopolized good at lower prices from the start if his economic advantage so dictates. Under some circumstances, he may even have occasion to abandon part of the quantity of the monopolized good at his disposal to destruction instead of bringing it to market, or, with the same result, to leave unused or to destroy part of the corresponding means of production at his command instead of employing them for the production of the monopolized good. He would adopt this policy if marketing the whole quantity of the monopolized good directly or indirectly available to him would oblige him to offer it to classes of the population who have so little purchasing power or desire for the good that, in spite of the larger quantities marketed, the resultant price would be so low that he would have a smaller profit and could be obtained by destroying a portion of the quantity of the monopolized good at his command, and selling only the remainder at a higher price to classes of the population having greater purchasing power. It would be entirely erroneous to assume that the price of a monopolized good, or even usually, rises or falls in an exactly inverse proportion to the quantities marketed by the monopolist, or that a similar proportionality exists between the price set by the monopolist and the quantity of the monopolized good that can be sold. If, for example, the monopolist brings 2,000 instead of 1,000 units of the monopolized good to market, the price of one unit will not necessarily fall from 6 florins, for example, to 3 florins. On the contrary, depending upon the economic situation, it may be, in one case, fall only to 5 florins, for example, but in another to as little as 2 florins. Under some circumstances, therefore, the total receipts that the monopolist obtains from the sale of a larger quantity of the monopolized good may be exactly the same as the total receipts yielded by the sale of a smaller quantity. Under other circumstances, however, they may be greater or less. If the monopolist, in our example, were to sell 1,000 units of the monopolized good, his total receipts would be 6,000 florins. For 2,000 units, he would not, however, necessarily receive 6,000 florins also, but perhaps as much as 10,000, or as little as 4,000, according to the circumstances of the case. The reason for this lies, ultimately, in the fact that there are great differences in the scales of equivalence for the various individuals with respect to different goods. Thus B, for example, may evaluate the first unit that he acquires of a certain good as the equivalent of 10 units of the good he gives in exchange, the second as the equivalent of 9 units, the third as the equivalent of 4, and the fourth as the equivalent of but 1 unit of the good given in exchange. With respect to another good, on the other hand, the above scale might appear as 8765. Suppose that the first good is grain, and that the second is some article of luxury. It is clear that an increase beyond a certain point in the quantity marketed would cause a much more rapid fall, and that a decrease in the quantity marketed would cause a much more rapid rise in the price of grain than in the price of the article of luxury. If it is assumed that all monopolists are economizing individuals aware of their advantage, then their policy is directed naturally neither to fixing the lowest possible price nor to selling the largest possible quantity of a monopolized good. It is directed neither to making the monopolized good available to the largest possible number of economizing individuals or groups of individuals, nor to providing each individual with the monopolized good to the fullest extent possible. The monopolist has no interest in all this. His economic policy is directed to making a maximum profit from the quantity of the monopolized good available to him. He does not, therefore, auction off the whole amount of the monopolized good at his disposal, but markets instead only such an amount as promises, at the expected price, to yield them the greatest profit. He does not fix the price at the precise level at which he can sell the whole quantity of the monopolized good at his command, but instead at the level most likely to yield the maximum profit. The correct economic policy from his point of view is obviously to offer only such quantities of the monopolized good for sale, or to set the price at such a level as will yield the greatest profit in either case. From a monopolistic point of view, his policy would be incorrect if, in spite of the fact that he could make a higher profit by marketing a smaller quantity of the monopolized good, he were nevertheless to sell a larger quantity. His policy would still be more uneconomic if, instead of confining himself to the production of the quantity of the monopolized good, whose sale promises him the highest profit, he were to increase this quantity with an expenditure of economic goods and other sacrifices on his part, and nevertheless cause his eventual profit to be smaller. It would be incorrect if he were to set a price so low that, although he could sell large quantities, he would obtain a smaller profit than if he had set the price higher. Above all, this policy would be incorrect if he were to set the price of the monopolized good so low that he could not fully supply all the purchasers competing for it, to whom exchange would be economic at this price, and if some of them had to go without the good. A situation of this sort would be a distinct proof that he had set the price too low. What has been said here is supported by experience and by history. The policies of all monopolists have, as their economic activities clearly demonstrate, been conducted in accordance with the above considerations. The Dutch East India Company in the 17th century caused part of the spice plants in the Moluccas to be destroyed. Large stocks of spices have frequently been burned in the East Indies and tobacco in North America. The guilds sought by various means to limit the number of artisans as much as possible, by long apprenticeship, by prohibition of more than a certain number of apprentices, etc. All these measures were correct from a monopolistic standpoint, since the quantities of the several monopolized commodities reaching the market were regulated in a manner favorable to the monopolists or to the corporations of monopolists. When freer trade, the emergence of factories, and other influences prevented the guilds from regulating independently the quantities of goods entering the market, the entire guild organization became ineffective, so far as its monopolistic character was concerned. Monopolistic fines and similar measures, directly influencing price formation at once, gave way before the impact of the larger quantities of goods brought to market. Originally, these fines were intended to subject single individuals, called price cutters, who failed to appreciate the interest of the whole guild or corporate body of monopolists, to limitations profitable to the monopolistic group. When the power of the guilds to control the quantities of goods brought to market was wrested from them, the regulations could no longer be enforced. The most anxious concern of all members of a guild was always the regulation of the marketing of handicraft products, so that only quantities would be sold as corresponded to their interest. Those who interfered in this regulation were always regarded by the guilds as their most dangerous opponents, against whom they incessantly appealed to governments for protection. The breach in the regulatory activity was made by the great quantities of manufactured products supplied by large-scale industry, signified by the fall of the guild system. Summarizing what has been said in this section, we find that, for each quantity of a good that a monopolist decides to sell, the price is determined independently of his will; that at each price that he decides to set for a unit of the monopolized good, the quantity is determined independently; the distribution of goods is governed in either case in accordance with exact laws; and that the entire course of economic events is throughout not fortuitous, but capable of reducing to definite principles. Even the fact that it is in the power of the monopolist to choose either his price or the quantities sold, does not, as well as we have seen, imply any indeterminacy of the economic phenomena resulting from his decision. Although the monopolist has the power to set higher or lower prices, or to market larger or smaller quantities of the monopolized good, there is only one particular price and only one particular quantity of the monopolized good brought to market that corresponds most exactly to his economic interest. If the monopolist is an economizing individual, therefore, he will not proceed in an arbitrary fashion in determining his price or the quantity of the monopolized good he will sell, but in accordance with definite principles. Each given economic situation sets definite limits within which price formation and the distribution of goods must take place, and any price and distribution of goods that is outside these limits is economically impossible. The phenomena of monopoly trade present us, therefore, with a picture of strict conformity in every respect to definite laws. Here too, of course, error and imperfect knowledge may give rise to aberrations, but these are the pathological phenomena of social economy, and prove as little against the laws of economics as do the symptoms of a sick body against the laws of physiology.